Hey, I'm Ryan from the Burnout Show, and today I'm going to show you how to install your pistons into your engine block. These pistons are actually going in my Chevy 350 that I'm rebuilding, and I'm doing a series on the whole process, so I've already got a bunch of videos about taking the engine apart, and now I'm making a bunch on putting the engine together. So if you're interested in that, definitely hit the subscribe button. And we've also got a big project coming up with my Camaro that this 350 came out of, so definitely stay tuned for that. But for right now, let's focus on the pistons. So typically the first step for this whole process is actually going to be putting together the piston assembly. So you'll have the piston rod, the wrist pin, and the piston head itself. And you might have to put them together. Mine came pre-installed, so I didn't have to worry about that. But it's super easy. Basically, you just line up the hole in the rod and the hole in the piston head, put the wrist pin through, and install the retainer clips on either side. So the next step after that is going to be installing the piston rings, which I actually already have a video about on this channel. There will be a link to that up in that corner. If you haven't done that yet, go ahead and check out that video. But if you have, then the next step is going to be installing the bearings. So your piston rods will probably come with the rod caps installed on them. So you're going to actually have to loosen these bolts so that we can install the bearings. All right, so I was actually having a bit of a hard time loosening the bolts from the connecting rod cap. So I actually had to stick it in my vise so that I would be able to get enough leverage on it and loosen those bolts. But once you've got that done, you're going to want to get your piston rod bearings. So with these, sometimes they might be designated specifically for upper or lower position. They might be marked specifically like that. And if they are, make sure that you put them in the correct spot. Mine don't have any designations on them, so they're good to go in either the upper or lower spot. But basically, installing a bearing is super easy. There's a small tab sticking out on one side of the bearing. Then there's a small groove that matches up with it on the inside of the rod cap. So basically you just line that tab up with that groove and then you push the bearing in place. Super simple, super easy, just sometimes gets a little tedious when you have to do it 16 different times. But basically just make sure that it's flush on both sides, or as flush as it can be. And then we're gonna go ahead and do the same thing to the piston. So next we're going to need some engine assembly lube. You can use basically any kind. They come in a few different styles. There's a more oil type style and a more grease type style. I've got an oily one here. But basically you just want to take the engine assembly lube and put a little bit of that on the bearing. You don't need a ton, but you do want to make sure that you have enough. You can see it's the green stuff here. You don't need a ton, but you do want to make sure that you have enough to cover the whole bearing. So in case you don't know, what this does is basically it lubricates these bearings for the first few starts. So initially when you're starting your engine after rebuilding it, oil hasn't had a chance to pump through the entire engine. It hasn't had a chance to get into these grooves yet. So you need to put in engine assembly lube so that it's not starting and moving dry for the first few starts. So that just makes it run a lot smoother right away and alleviates any possible damage. Alright, so after all that, we're basically ready to put the pistons inside the engine. But first, we need to compress the piston rings with a piston ring compression tool. Alright, so this is super simple, but there is one thing that you need to worry about. You need to worry about the piston ring gap placement. So once you have those in the correct position, you can go ahead and take your compression tool and stick it right on over. Again, being careful to try to keep those rings in the right position. And while you're doing this, you want to leave just a tiny bit of the piston skirt sticking out on the bottom to make it easier to set this down in the cylinder. So go ahead and start tightening this to compress the rings. Again, leaving just a little bit of that skirt sticking out. You don't want to crank it down too tight because you do need the piston to be able to slide out of this tool. But once you've got those rings compressed, now we're ready to go over to the engine. All right, so now that we're at the engine, the first thing that we're going to do is lightly oil the surface of the cylinder. If you haven't done that already. Some of you may have already done this because you were storing it for a while before you put anything back in. But if you haven't done it, just get a little bit of regular motor oil, spread it on your hand. I'm wearing a glove just because it's a little cleaner. And just lightly put a thin layer of oil on the cylinder walls. This has a very similar function to the engine assembly lube we put on the bearings. It just lubricates, gives a light lubrication to everything before it has a chance to fully get lubricated once it's running. All right, so now that we've done that, it's time to actually take your piston and start putting it in the cylinder. Now, one thing to note about this is that most pistons actually only have one way that they can go in. See, typically on your rod, you'll have a beveled edge and you'll have a flat edge. Obviously, this is slightly beveled, but this side is obviously more beveled. And so basically, the beveled edge goes up against the crankshaft. So inside the engine, depending on what engine you have, there might be two piston rods sitting up next to each other on the crankshaft. The flat end goes against the flat end on the next one, and the beveled end of the rod goes up against the crankshaft. So over here, I'm putting the beveled end on the crankshaft. Then we just sit the piston compression tool right down on top of the cylinder. Now we're going to take the handle of a rubber mallet and lightly tap the piston down into the cylinder. While you're doing this, you also need to go down to the bottom and guide the rod end over the crankshaft. Keep tapping the piston down. Oop, my glove got caught. Until it's free. This piston actually has, there we go, just a tiny bit more room. Now the bearing and the rod are sitting flush on the crankshaft. All right, so now that we've got the piston in the cylinder, we need to flip over the engine so that we can work on putting the connecting rod cap on the back of the crankshaft. But while we're flipping over the engine, you want to be careful that the piston doesn't fall out of the cylinder because it can happen. So just be careful of that. All right, so now we'll take our rod cap and we'll get it ready to put on the end of our piston rod. Keep in mind once again that the beveled edge goes towards the crankshaft. This side has the flat edge, this side has the beveled edge. So it will have a specific orientation. So I'm putting mine in like this. And then push it up flush against the rod, just like that. All right, so before you go and start threading in your bolts, you're gonna need to put a little bit of assembly lube on your threads. Mine actually came with a little bit already on there, but I'm gonna take a little bit more and put it on. For this, I'm using a grease type assembly lube. This actually came with my engine rebuild kit. Then just spread it around a little bit. All right, now I'm just gonna start threading that in a little bit. Then I'm gonna go ahead and put more assembly lube on the other bolt. All right, so now that I have those threaded in a little bit, I'm actually gonna spin my crankshaft so that it's a little bit easier to work on these bolts and you can see them better. Now that I've done that, I'm gonna go ahead and finger tighten these all the way down. All right, so the next and basically final step is gonna be getting your torque wrench. So my manual recommends doing just about 50 foot-pounds for this size bolt in this engine. Your number will probably vary, but just make sure you look up the correct torque spec and set your torque wrench to it, and then go ahead and start torquing them down. All right, now some manufacturers might recommend loosening and then retorquing these bolts multiple times. If yours does, go ahead and do that, but if not, then you are done. All right, so now that first piston is installed, which means after that, you just go ahead and do it again for the rest of them. Pretty simple process overall. You just gotta make sure that you do all the little steps correctly, and then everything goes smoothly and you got yourself a running engine in no time. So yeah, that's gonna be it for this video. Like I said in the beginning, I am doing a tutorial series on a lot of the steps involved in rebuilding your engine, so definitely subscribe if you're interested in that. Hit the like button if you liked this video and you found it helpful. Let me know in the comments if there's a specific tutorial that you want to see me do, or if you think that I missed any crucial information in this tutorial. But like I said, that's gonna be it for this video. So, thank you for watching, and I hope this helped.